Yeah, Mochi's sitting right here next to me on the windowsill. Hey, Mochi. You know I'm talking about you, huh? Well, kids, it is 2021. It's a new year. Although I will say, as I mentioned to the last class, 2021 has so far in the first 11 days been suspiciously similar to 2020. It has not been, when New Year's Eve was here, like the day before New Year's Eve, I found myself pretty much blown away. Like, holy smokes, we're already at the end. Well, not already at the end of the year, but holy smokes, the new year is coming. And I just couldn't get excited about it. I don't know. Unlike other years where it's like, oh, it's New Year's, let's celebrate the new year coming in here. It just kind of felt like more of the same. And between all of the political upheaval, the COVID, and all the rest of it, so far, 2021 has been about par for the course as far as 2020 resemblance. But nonetheless, it is a new year. I wanted to take a few minutes today to just kind of talk about a few things. Not once in my teaching career have I started second semester of AP Euro on the French Revolution. Typically, it is the last unit of the first semester. And so most often by the time that we are starting second semester, I am done with the French Revolution. I'm done talking about Napoleon, and we are on to talking about the Industrial Revolution. For the first time in my teaching career, 12 years in, I am actually behind where I usually am. Why? Well, not for lack of trying, that's for sure. We were on pace until about 3 weeks before the end of the semester. But it occurred to me that at the end of the semester, we had not even done a single DBQ yet. And if you recall, we spent some time, about a week and a half, talking about DBQs, how to write DBQs, practice DBQs, etc. This ate into the instructional time that I otherwise would have used to lecture on the French Revolution, which I'll be doing today. The fact of the matter, kids, is that this year is very much, in my view, a mulligan. If you don't know what a mulligan is, it's a golf term where you basically throw out a bad shot. I don't play golf, but if you shoot really bad in golf, you can call a mulligan and you get your shot back. You bring the ball back to where it was. You take a 2-stroke penalty and you keep playing. It's kind of a write-off. This year I just don't have the instructional minutes. I've never had to cover this amount of content in the amount of time that I have with you guys. The classes are shorter because of distance instruction. I am not in class with you, and this has resulted in us now falling a bit behind because there's certain things I gotta do and I only have so much time to be able to do them. It's unfortunate, really, because frankly, I don't find distance instruction preferable to teaching in the classroom. It's not, from my perspective, I've been doing this a long time. The fun part about teaching is cut out of distance instruction. The fun part of teaching And I can tell just because of how you guys interact with me on the chat, okay, this would be a really fun class. We would have a whole lot of fun in the classroom setting. And I think that you would find the class to be a lot more enjoyable if we were able to meet together. It's just not the same. Usually, when a winter break ends, I don't mind. You know, I don't mind going back into the classroom because I get to see kids I care about and joke around with you and have some fun and talk about how you're doing and, you know, things like that. The fun stuff, the human part of the job, right? The human part of the job. And I don't really get that with you guys in distance instruction. I can't say that I'm overly excited to spend the next several months lecturing to myself, essentially. You know, it's not that much fun. Imagine being a stand-up comedian and giving stand-up in front of an empty auditorium. No laughs, no applause, no boos even. You don't even know how you're doing. Am I killing it or am I bombing it? I don't know. It's hard. It's very, very hard. Because I can read the faces of students sometimes, see if people are getting it, if they're not getting it. Can't do that distance instruction wise. So, unfortunately, we are behind. I'm going to do the best that I can to catch us up and cover everything that I need to. Let's talk about the French Revolution. Before I jump over to the PowerPoint, we need to kind of set the stage a little bit here. Bring you back into the fold, all right? Bring you back into kind of where we left off. So, if you'll recall, the last couple of units that we learned about in first semester were the Enlightenment and kind of 18th century society in France, talking about the societal structure of 18th century Europe, rather, not just France, but a lot of places in Europe, talking about things like population growth, talking about the agricultural revolution, talking about emerging ideas of capitalism and how those interacted with mercantilism and those kinds of things. All right. So this is kind of the most recent stuff that we learned about in the class, right? We're in the 1700s. All right, 1700s. We also learned about some conflicts that happened in the 18th century, the 1700s. There were a number of different conflicts between Britain and France. And that's very important for characterizing the French Revolution because it's that rivalry that serves as one long-term cause of why the French Revolution happens in the first place. There are a number of different causes to the French Revolution. Some of them are long-term causes, others of them are more immediate short-term causes, and we'll be talking about both of them as we move throughout the unit. Before we actually start talking about the French Revolution, though, I actually have to talk to you about a different revolution that actually came before the French Revolution. It preceded it by about 15 years. And the revolution that I'm referring to is the American Revolution. Now, let's just recap a little bit about what government looks like in Europe at this time. You have to remember that going all the way back to the very beginning of the year, all the way back to the late Middle Ages, European society was characterized by a very rigid social structure, where you had a tiny amount of nobles at the top of the population, and you had a vast segment of common folk at the bottom, okay? Very, very segmented. For centuries, the only kind of government that most of Europe knew was absolute monarchy, okay? Feudalism. Nobles owning a bunch of land, peasants living on that land, farming that land, paying taxes to support the nobles. And then the nobles at the top of society were the ones who had the most wealth, they had the most privilege, they weren't taxed and things like that. and they're the ones who hold political office. They're the ones who make decisions on a grand level for the entire kingdom. And as we move forward, we are moving into an age now of, instead of looking at Europe as being kingdoms, as more looking at Europe as being made up of nation states, okay? Political states of groups of people with common culture, all right? So the French living in France, okay? The British living in Britain, the Germans living in Germany, okay? This idea of nation states is what we will gradually be making our way towards as we get into the 19th century, the 1800s. But let's take it back to the 1700s. Let's take it back to actually the mid-1700s, the 1750s into the 1760s. And the most important thing that happened in the mid-18th century in terms of political conflict in Europe was known as the 7 Years' War. You may remember learning about it last semester. Now, the 7 Years' War actually started due to Austria and Prussia having disputes over Silesia and so on. You might remember learning about the enlightened despots, you know, Frederick the Great, Frederick II of Prussia, who waged war against Austria to take Silesia from Austria. You might remember learning about how Marie Theresa, who was the Queen of Austria, Habsburg ruler of Austria, ended up fighting back to try to take back Silesia. But the 7 Years' War very quickly turned into a conflict between Britain and France. And actually the biggest segment of the 7 Years' War wasn't even fought in Europe. It was fought in North America. And the North American campaign of the 7 Years' War is a lot of times by Americans referred to as the French and Indian War. Why? Because at the time, America had not yet been established. America during the 7 Years' War was still under the control of Great Britain. The colonies in North America, the 13 colonies, Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Massachusetts, Delaware, Connecticut, so on and so forth. All of these 13 colonies were under British colonial rule. These were British colonies that Britain was fighting in North America to protect, okay? And they were fighting against the French in North America, who were allied with the Native Americans, because the French, going back centuries, had more benevolent, friendly relationships with Native Americans than the British did. So when we call it the French and Indian War, that's from the British perspective, the British colonial perspective, saying that the British colonists and the British military were fighting against both the French and the Native Americans in North America. Okay, but it's all part of this giant global conflict that broke out in Europe in 1754 called the 7 Years' War. All right, why is this so significant? Why are we repeating learning about the 7 Years' War? Well, first of all, Britain emerged victorious in that conflict. They defeated the French in North America and in other places too, India, for example. After the 7 Years' War comes to an end with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the British, one of the reasons that they were able to defeat the French in this conflict is because going back to about 1694, 1698, somewhere in that area, the very tail end of the 1600s, the British had established a British national bank, the Bank of England. Okay, the Bank of England. And the British National Bank was able to essentially give the British government loans against itself. When we talk about national debt, okay, national debt, it's something that a lot of folks confuse. If we take a modern day example, a lot of the debt that America is in right now is debt that America is in to itself, essentially. Okay, money that America has borrowed against its future prosperity. All right, under the belief that as America's economy continues to grow and as the population of America continues to grow over the course of the next century, that whatever debt is incurred today will be more than paid for with future dollars, with the economy of America growing. So the vast majority of debt that America holds is against America, okay? Most people think that debt is only ever owned by foreign nations, and that's not the case. It is true that some of America's debt is held by many different nations, but the vast majority of America's debt is actually debt to America itself. This is the same thing that the British did to get through the 7 Years' War. The Bank of England made it so that the British were able to take out loans against future governmental revenue that they would collect through taxation. And so when the British were fighting the war, they were taking out huge amounts of national debt to finance the war, to be able to win the war. And they do. It's very successful. But at the end of the war, then the goal immediately turns to, we need to pay this debt back, and we need to do it promptly. Why is this significant? Well, because the way that they go about paying back some of that debt is to go right over to those colonists that they had just fought the war to protect in America, North America, and start implementing a number of new taxes on them. These new taxes, you've probably heard of some of them before. The Stamp Act is the most famous one, okay? The Stamp Act had, you have to think of it from kind of two different perspectives. Now, folks, my family, okay, if you were to trace back my lineage, for goodness sakes, my last name is Knight, K-N-I-G-H-T. It doesn't get much more English than that, all right? My family, if you were to trace back my ancestry, goes back centuries in America, okay? My ancestry are amongst some of the earliest colonists in the American colonies, okay? We're talking like mid to late 1600s, not that far after the Mayflower, okay? So my ancestry goes back a long time, and there's a part of me, because of my distinct Americanness, where, you know, I appreciate that the Americans broke away from Britain and established the first democracy, the first Republican, small r, not capital R Republican Party, but small r Republican Democratic representative government that the world had seen in 2,000 years. I'm proud of that, okay? There are parts of my American ancestry that I'm proud of. There's other parts of my American ancestry that, we have to be honest, I'm not so proud of, right? There's a lot of problems in America that we're still working through today. You know, so not all of American history is great history. You know, we just have to call it what it is. Why am I mentioning this? Because you have to understand the other perspective, which is the British perspective of the American Revolution. When the British get done fighting this war, they look to the colonies. They say, hey, you know, we just fought this war. We just spent exorbitant amounts of money to finance the war. We're in tremendous amounts of debt. And we are now going to start passing laws that make it so that how about a little something for the effort here? They start passing laws that tax the colonists. To me, as a modern day American and a rational thinking human being, I think to myself, if I was Britain, I'd do the exact same thing. They just fought this war to protect the colonists, and now the colonists are being taxed to help pay for that war. Seems perfectly reasonable. The British Parliament certainly thought that it was reasonable. The British King, King George III, thought it was perfectly reasonable. But the American colonists, who were at the end of the war proud of their British national identity. Keep in mind that being an American colonist, or a colonist in North America, meant that you were a subject of Britain, the largest colonial power, now undisputed colonial power because they've defeated France, who's permanently relegated to second place afterwards. Okay? Why wouldn't you want the protection of the British government? The British government is huge. They're super wealthy, they're super powerful, they've got a massive military, and they've just come off the most important victory of the most important war of the 18th century. Why wouldn't you want to be a part of that? And so a lot of the American colonists were super proud of their British ancestry, of belonging to the British colonial empire. So why do they start turning against it? Well, it has to do with this whole taxation thing. When the British started passing laws like the Stamp Act, one of the things that people really fail to understand from the American side of things, when we hear the American story of, my job, guys, is to tell you history as it is. I'm not here to tell you this story that's got the, shiny, glittery finish to it that leaves out all the bad stuff. Okay, that's part of the reason that we're in this whole political chaos that we have today, is because people believe certain things about history that are not supported by fact. Okay, they're not supported by evidence. If you want to know why we've had so many problems recently, it's because of the number of unprecedented lies and misinformation that have spread around that give people a very glossy-eyed, rosy, retrospective perspective of American history. Oh, those darn British folks, they tried to tax us and we said, we're not gonna take it. No, right? Okay, not exactly. Not exactly. That's not how it went, guys. Okay, we have to understand that the reason that the Americans reject these taxes has everything to do with economic liberty. Okay? The Americans didn't want to pay taxes because they had gotten so used to, prior to the 7 Years' War, having a whole lot of flexibility to manage their own affairs. The colonists are all the way across the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. The British government is all the way over in England. And locally, if you have a bridge that goes out in your tiny little colonial town in Massachusetts, or if you have road repairs that need to be done, or you need to build a new city hall because the last one burned down, all of these kinds of problems were solved on a local level. The American colonists, or the British colonists in America, Virginia, Maryland, etc., got very used to managing their own affairs. But when the 7 Years' War ends and the British government decides to clamp down on the American colonists, they take offense to that. They're immediately incensed, despite the fact that just a year earlier, they had been proud of their British identity. Okay, they were happy to be a part of the British Empire. There were a lot of benefits to it. Not to mention, okay, the Stamp Act that they passed, which, if you don't know what the Stamp Act is, what it was this law that was passed by Parliament on the colonists, where in order to have any official documents made official, we're talking about things like land deeds, marriage licenses, wills, newspapers, even playing cards, things like this. So anything that was considered like something that was regulated by the government. In order to make that document official, you had to go and get an official stamp on it, like a rubber stamp, not a stamp that you put on a letter, a rubber stamp, like an ink pad stamp, okay? And that stamp you had to pay for. And the Americans are like, this is ludicrous. We shouldn't have to pay for anything, okay? The British are like, what are you, nuts? We just got done fighting this war for you, and now you refuse to pay this tax. Not to mention, this tax had already existed in England for over 50 years. In England. Okay, so English people were already paying this for half a century, and the stamp tax in England was heavier than the stamp tax, I can't say it, Stamp Act or stamp tax that was passed for the colonists, which was a lesser amount of money than what the English Stamp Act was. So, you know, the English government is looking at these American colonists like, you guys gotta be nuts. Why would you not pay this? We just fought to protect your British colonists, and the British subjects are, you know, the American British colonial subjects are like, we don't want to pay it. We don't want to pay this Stamp Act. It's unfair, and this is the other famous thing that no taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. Okay, let's be clear on that point. Let's be clear. Not one person in America, not one, actually would have wanted representation of the colonists in Parliament. The reason being that, let's say that the colonies do get a seat in Parliament. Okay, let's say that that whole no taxation without representation, what they're talking about is we shouldn't be subject to taxes passed by British Parliament overseas because we don't have a seat in Parliament. So we didn't have a say in whether or not that stamp, or that we didn't have a say in whether or not we agree to this tax. Here's the reality of it. If the American colonists would have gotten a seat in Parliament, they certainly wouldn't have gotten 13 seats. They wouldn't have gotten a parliamentary seat for every colony. They would have gotten one for all of the colonies, all right, at most. And the British weren't going to do that, but let's say that they did, okay? One seat wouldn't have even been enough to have any effect whatsoever on whether or not taxes got passed on the American colonists, okay? So it would have been futile. And if they had gotten that seat in Parliament, it would have only further meant that the British would have then said, see, you have your seat. Oh, you got outvoted. Turns out you got to pay this tax. It would have only further obligated them to having to pay those taxes because, hey, you're in Parliament, you're represented. Too bad you got outvoted, and now you're going to pay the tax. So the American subjects didn't want representation in Parliament. That was a convenient political argument to make, using the principles of the Enlightenment to say that the British were being tyrannical by forcing the American subjects to pay taxes that they didn't have a say in voting against. It's a convenient political argument, but really it's an argument that is in reality not something that they actually wanted. They didn't really want representation in Parliament because of that whole further obligating them to actually pay the taxes that Parliament passed. Now you might be wondering, you know, hey, we're in the French Revolution. Why are you spending so much time talking about the American Revolution? Well, it has a lot to do with France, actually, because the French came into the American Revolution on the side of America. Not because the French had some sort of soft spot in their heart for the American colonists, and it had also nothing to do with the fact that the French wanted to help the Americans fight for their freedom. It has nothing to do with any of those things. The French get themselves involved in the American Revolution for essentially one reason and one reason alone, and that is purely to stick it to the British, okay? They want to dig that knife in and turn the blade to the British economy because they don't want to see the British, you know, they want to see the British hurt, okay? They would love to see the American colonies break away from Britain because the American colonies were so profitable to the British. So the French are completely happy to see the Americans break away. They don't care what happens to America. They care about what happens to Britain being weakened by America breaking away from Britain. So that's why the French help out. Notably, though, one of the things that happens when the French help out in the American Revolution is it basically is the nail in the coffin of the French economy, which had already been struggling because they lost the 7 Years' War just 20 years earlier, not even 13 years earlier, okay? So when the French lost the 7 Years' War, this was a major, major blow to France. And it put France in a very precarious economic situation, which we'll talk a little bit more about as one of the more immediate causes of the French Revolution as we move closer to it. All right. Now, when the American Revolution comes to an end in 1781, the war is basically over. Okay, so the American Revolution is fought from 1776. Okay, you might know like July 4th, Independence Day, 4th of July, right, is the day that America officially declares their independence from Britain. And we fight this war against Britain for about 5 years. And Britain eventually just kind of like throws their hat in there, like or throws the towel, and we're not gonna fight anymore, because the British really, it was an uphill battle. There was no way that the British were going to be able to subdue all of the regions of the colonies. Tiny little Britain and the massive amount of land that the American colonists occupied. Not to mention the size of the American population was growing by about 10 times every 100 years. It was huge. Okay, like we went from having 200 and some thousand people to 2.15 million people inside of about 70 years. That's exorbitant population growth. Okay, so it was just going to be really, really difficult for Britain to regain control of the colonies that were in insurrection. They were revolting. So the British lose in 1781. The American Revolution is a nice kind of clean-cut revolution. America, right from the get-go, due to having to kind of manage their own affairs for so long prior to the 7 Years' War, because they had gotten so used to managing their local affairs, kind of using quasi-democratic styles of town hall meetings and local colonial governments, as well as having a lot of freedom of trade, and America being one of the #1 places in the world where people were consuming the intellectual materials of the Enlightenment, readings by Voltaire, readings by Montesquieu. Right from the get-go, when America breaks away from Britain, they decide we're going to establish a government inspired by the Enlightenment ideals. And that's really, really huge, because it's the first place on the planet that has had a democratic-style government, or even anything close to a democratic-style government, for basically 2,000 years. So, so here's how the American Revolution goes. It's very clean cut. Okay, the American Revolution starts when they start declaring their independence. There's a few other things that kind of preceded, like the Boston Massacre or the Boston Tea Party. The American Revolution is like, oh, we're going to take some tea and throw it in the harbor. We're going to, Lexington Concord, Minutemen, shot heard around the world, fight a 5-year-long war against the British, emerge victorious. There's only 2 blueprints for government that ever existed in the United States. For the first 6 or 7 years of the United States' existence, we had something called the Articles of Confederation. This was the first, instruction manual for what American government is going to look like. But the Articles of Confederation had some problems. It pitted the states against one another. It kept the federal government decentralized. There was no ability for the national government to raise a military or to collect taxes. And so the United States as a nation under the Articles of Confederation remained very, very, very weak. And economically in competition, there was lots of competitiveness between the economies of more populous states like Virginia and less populous states like Georgia, and so on and so forth. So it was riddled with problems. So that only lasts for like 6 or 7 years. And then we get to 1787, and that's when they start to look at revising the Articles of Confederation, and then they ultimately just end up scrapping them and coming up with the same document that we have, which is the blueprint for our government today, known as the Constitution. So the American Revolution is really relatively straightforward, right? War, Articles of Confederation, Constitution. Constitution has lasted us 240 years since then, okay? Good long time, 230 years, whatever, okay? And that's it. The French Revolution, not so clean cut. The French Revolution is a little messier. And so that is one of the things that is complicated about talking about the French Revolution, is because it's kind of chaotic. And the reason that the French Revolution is so much more chaotic than the American Revolution is because, unlike America, which going back to Jamestown had kind of had to deal with self-sufficiency, had to deal with local governmental issues and stuff like that, America had never really lived under absolutism. Remember that Britain was a constitutional monarchy, so Parliament had subdued the power of the king. Also in Britain, it's not really democratic, okay? Britain's not really democratic. They have a constitutional monarchy where the nobles are able to vote, but that's only like 1 or 2% of the population. It's not that many people. So it's not real democracy. When America gets founded, they set up a republic where pretty much anyone who had essentially a certain amount of land and was a male and who was an adult was able to vote in local political affairs and vote for president and other things like that. Okay? That is going to be, even though not the majority of the population, it's going to be much, much closer to being democratic than what Britain was under constitutional monarchy. Okay, because when we establish our government here in America, we get rid of all of those noble titles: Duke, Duchess, Baron, Marquis, Count. All of those noble titles, birthright titles, get thrown out, and now it's based more on, number one, are you a male? Number two, are you do you own land? And so on and so forth, okay? We also, in the Constitution, took a lot of those Enlightenment principles. Think about Montesquieu. Montesquieu had talked about, separation of powers, judicial, executive, and legislative branch of government, and each of them having checks and balances against one another to make sure that no one branch became more powerful than the other. We also incorporated ideas from Voltaire about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. Those kinds of things get put into the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. We also incorporated ideas from John Locke, who talked about, really John Locke was who Thomas Jefferson drew most of his influence from during the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence talks about the pursuit of happiness, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whereas John Locke talked about life, liberty, and property, and how the government was supposed to protect those assets. Now, of course, we have to be real about that conversation, because the fact of the matter is that as Thomas Jefferson is writing about life, liberty, and property, not only does he own slaves, but he's actually engaged in sexual relationships with his slaves, at least one of them, and fathering children with his slaves. There's a lot of contradiction there, right? Because here we have this country that's founded on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and also built on the backs of slaves who are denied all of those things, right? So we need to be honest about this conversation, and how America certainly does not start off perfect. But the idea being that as time has gone on, that America strives to become more perfect, and that part of that of achieving that perfection or ideal of perfection is implementing reforms, like getting rid of slavery and getting rid of the Jim Crow laws and passing the Civil Rights Act and things like that. So as time has gone on, we have become a freer nation than what we were when we first started back in the 1700s. Nonetheless, point being that John Locke was very inspirational to Thomas Jefferson in terms of the idea of revolting against the British in the first place, who the colonists viewed as being tyrannical and not protecting their life, liberty, and property. So, all of these Enlightenment ideals get wrapped up into the American government, and it's the first time that we've seen a government do this anywhere in the world. But the French government is absolutely inspired by the Americans when they do this. Because remember that so many of these Enlightenment ideas came from France. And so when the war ends and France really, to be honest with you, France had nothing to gain from joining the American Revolution. They do it purely to stick it to the British, as I mentioned earlier. And so what do they gain from it? They gain the model. They gain inspiration. The French were very much inspired by the American Revolution, particularly the segment of population of French people known as the bourgeoisie, the kind of upper middle class group of people who'd been excluded from holding any political power, but were wealthy and educated enough to realize how unfair their situation was in French society. After all, these people are wealthy, they're educated, some of them are lawyers, doctors, bankers, merchants, etc., and they have absolutely no say in what happens in the French government because the French government is still absolutist by the time that the American Revolution breaks out. But right about the same time that we're writing up the Constitution, things in France are reaching a breaking point. And this is now finally where we can begin to talk a bit about the French Revolution. So I'm going to swap over here to my desktop and pull this up, and here we go. So the French Revolution became the most monumental upheaval of the Revolutionary Age. And the Society of France prior to, one sec, I'm just going to double check and make sure. Is my screen sharing right? Yeah, it is. Okay, good. All right. Very, very good. By the way, but you know what? Before I move on real quick, I'm going to just take a pause right there. Did any of you folks have any questions on the things that I covered just now? Anything that I can clear up for anyone? Anything I can clear up for folks? Guys, you guys feel okay with talking about you feel pretty comfortable? You're not going to be tested on the American Revolution necessarily, but the first part of chapter 19, all right? Oh, this is what I was going to mention. I completely forgot. I'm going to try this semester, I'm going to try putting the reading guides up before the lectures, okay? So that when I'm going through the lectures, okay, you'll have the questions available to you so that you can answer those questions if you want. You don't have to. If you want to just focus and listen and watch what I'm talking about, you're welcome to do that too. But if you want to be going through the reading guide as I'm talking about the lecture, you're more than, sometimes it matches up better than others. So sometimes it may not as always be super helpful. But the first part of chapter 19 talks about the American Revolution. That's why I wanted to talk about it. And there's already, the assignment for today is already up on Canvas for you. And if you want to go through those questions as I'm talking about things and be typing in answers or typing in notes or whatever you do, you're more than welcome to do that. All right, I'm going to try and be a little bit more diligent about putting the reading guide assignments up before I lecture on that day, so that maybe if I cover anything that the reading guide goes over, you can use my lecture to help supplement the your answers on the reading guide. Okay? All right, if there's no questions, I'm going to jump back here then, and we'll start talking about the French Revolution. So let's just bring you back. All right, I'm gonna mention to you a couple of different things. Before I get started here, I mentioned to you a minute ago that the French Revolution is a little more complicated than the American Revolution is. All right, French Revolution is a little more complicated than the American Revolution. American Revolution is basically you have the war, you have the Articles of Confederation, and you have the Constitution. The French Revolution, within the first 20 years of the French Revolution, within the first 20 years of the French Revolution, we have already 6 different iterations of government. 6. Guys, we've had 2 in the last 230 years, 240 years. We've had 2. In their first 20 years, they have 6. That is one of the first reasons that the French Revolution is a bit complicated to wrap your brain around. This little graphic organizer that I have here, or chart, whatever you want to call it, is to help you organize the different iterations before I talk about them. Think of this kind of like a table of contents of the different phases of the French Revolution. Now, I want to stress something to you. Up in blue here, okay, the blue regions of this slide, when I say the age of Montesquieu or the age of Rousseau or the age of Voltaire, I am only using this for our class as nicknames, okay, to help you set the record straight in your own brain. If you talk about the age of Montesquieu, though, on the AP exam, the reader may or may not know what you're talking about. So I don't want you to refer to these different phases on the AP exam by these names. I'm using these names to help you build an extra point of connection in your brains about the kind of major phases of the French Revolution. All right, and there's 3 phases. There's what we call the early phase, the age of Montesquieu. Why do we call it that? Well, if you recall, Montesquieu was a French noble who, when he wrote his book on the spirit of laws, he was glorifying the British governmental system, which was a constitutional monarchy. So let's just start by saying this. When the French Revolution begins, the original goal of the French Revolution was not to create a democratic republic like the United States had made. The original goal was to use some of the same inspiration, like the Enlightenment, to institute a constitutional monarchy that permanently limited and subdued the powers of the king to the noble class, just like in Britain. How is that different from what America did? Well, it's different because, remember, America didn't have a king. America had an elected president based on not popular, but electoral votes. Okay, so the voting segment of the American population voted for representatives who were not from a noble class and leaders who were not monarchs. That is what makes America a republic. France, when they first start their revolution, are not trying to go that radical. Instead, what they're trying to do is to model their government after the British style of constitutional monarchy, where the king becomes more of a figurehead and the nobles serving in parliament are the ones that are the major lawmakers and decision makers of the government. Okay, so we have to say that when the French Revolution starts off, it's pretty moderate in its goals. They're not trying to go super, super radical when it first begins. All right, so we call that the Age of Montesquieu. Now, in the Age of Montesquieu, you'll notice that that is only a 3-year time span, 1789 to 1792. Not very long, but inside that 3-year time span, we see already two different blueprints of government. Now, this first one is known, and the earliest one that we will talk about is known as the National Assembly. The National Assembly, as we will learn in not too long a time, next class, it was always meant to be temporary. The National Assembly wasn't meant to be a permanent government. All right, it was only meant to stick around long enough until they had developed the blueprint for a constitutional monarchy, and then the National Assembly would dissolve and they would create a new government of a constitutional monarchy. And that's exactly what they did. And that new government became known as the Legislative Assembly. But you'll notice that only lasted for 1 year. How come, Mr. Knight? How come they spent 2 years developing a constitutional monarchy, they implement it, and then it only lasts for a year? Well, we'll get to that part of the story. There's a lot going on. I won't explain that today, but spoiler alert a little bit here, things don't go well, okay? Things go very, very bad, actually, in 1792 in France. When the Legislative Assembly is dissolved in right around September of 1792, the revolution changes into a much more radical revolution, a brutal bloodbath that saw the lives of tens of thousands of people in France ended by way of beheading, thanks to a new execution device known as the guillotine. And this phase of the Republic is what we refer to as, of the Revolution, is what we refer to as the Age of Rousseau. That's because Rousseau, if you'll remember, as an Enlightenment thinker, was very much an advocate of almost like a direct democracy representative style government. A much more radical form of government, one much more similar to the radical kind of government that the Americans had adopted. However, unlike America, which had a history of quasi-democratic processes through town hall meetings and stuff like that, France never had that. France had been absolutist for centuries. So when they try to implement this brand new radical form of Republican-style representative democratic government, it does not go over well. All right, it is extremely, it's almost like, it's like the dog that's been kept in the cage its whole life, and now it's like, freaked out by the giant world outside the cage. It's like too much for them to handle. And France didn't really know at that time how to properly implement these very, very radical political ideas that not only France, but nowhere else in Europe had ever tried out before. Okay, it's really, they're going from a super authoritarian, absolutist style government to a completely different radical form of government that no one had any experience with. And things get a little, forgive my colloquialism, things get a little cray-cray during this time. All right, the early part of the radical phase of the French Revolution, which lasts from 1792 to about 1799, the earliest part of it is the most radical part. This part right here, where the government, after the Legislative Assembly is dissolved, it is replaced by a new Republican style of government known as the National Convention. However, the leader of the National Convention was a guy named Maximilien Robespierre. He's actually pictured down here in the corner. Maximilien Robespierre used fear, used terror to retain control of the population during this time. And the number one way that he did that was by using the death penalty. So the reason that we use this phrase reign of terror to explain the years of the National Convention, when people think about the French Revolution, this is the period that people think about. This is the most memorable phase of the French Revolution. The time where things get really, really bad. Okay? So we'll talk more about that later. Maximilien Robespierre dies in 1794. And we'll talk about how he dies later. But I don't want to give everything away today. But when he dies, it's replaced by a new, somewhat less radical government known as the Directory. And the Directory lasts for about 4 years, but the Directory was really corrupt, basically, is the best word that I can describe for it. The Directory is weak. It fails on a number of promises that it makes. It's really difficult for the French state to, it wasn't working. And so in 1799, that's when Napoleon comes into the game. He overthrows the Directory in what became known as the coup d'etat Brumaire. And we'll talk about that again later on in the chapter here. But the Directory gets overthrown by Napoleon. People in France are extremely happy with that because Napoleon ushers in the final era of the French Revolution, where we go from it being the most radical to actually swinging all the way back to being much more conservative. And so under Napoleon, you essentially go back to having almost a monarchical kind of figure in power. But the reason we nickname it in our class the Age of Voltaire is because, if you remember, Voltaire was a huge advocate of enlightened despotism. Remember that Voltaire actually liked absolutism so long as the absolute ruler was in favor of Enlightenment principles. And that's kind of the kind of leader that they get in Napoleon. Napoleon is not a traditional monarch. He doesn't come from royal blood. He is a noble, but he is a noble who supports the ideas of the Enlightenment. And remember that Napoleon was himself in favor of the French Revolution when it was being fought. And so when Napoleon comes to power, the early part of Napoleon's reign is known as the Consulate era. The Consulate era, where his official title is First Consul of France. And then in 1804, he actually ends up declaring himself the Emperor of France, which was kind of hearkening back to the Roman Empire, where as Napoleon's power grew, he viewed himself increasingly as an imperial sort of leader, an emperor of sorts. And so the last part of Napoleon's reign, the last about 11 years, is known as the Napoleonic Empire, and that ends in 1815 after Napoleon's last defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Now let's go back to what France looked like just prior to the French Revolution. You might remember learning about Louis XV, who was the leader of France during the majority of the 18th century. So Louis XV reigned. This is the period that this is not his lifespan. This is the period that he reigned. He reigned from 1715 until his death in 1774. Throughout Louis XV's reign, he was very heavily influenced by people who manipulated him, including the most famous mistress and his favorite mistress, and her name was Madame de Pompadour. And she had undue influence on Louis XV's political decisions. Also, during Louis XV's early reign, when he first came to power after the death of Louis XIV and the end of the War of Spanish Succession, he was very much more of a party king, all right, kind of a saucy boy, as we'll call him, all right, and so he liked to party, he liked court festivities, he liked all of the things that go with being the king of France. You're the king of France, life is good when you're king, and he very much enjoyed being king, but he didn't really like the business, the day-to-day business or job of being a king. And so because he does not really tend to his kingly affairs as closely as he should have early on in his reign, he ends up losing the level of absolute authority that his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, had been able to exert at the Palace of Versailles over the nobles. So, for example, under Louis XV, early on, the Parliament of Paris, Paris was divided into, there were several different parliaments for each of the different districts of France. And the Parliament of Paris was the largest and most influential of them because, of course, it's Paris and it's the capital of France. And under Louis XV, they regained the right to approve the king's decrees, meaning that the king's power gets checked by the Parliament of Paris, which consisted largely of nobles of the robe. Remember that nobles of the robe were people who had purchased their noble title. And this is what caused the noble population of France to grow from 1% of the population to about 3% of the population. And so what do? Once the nobles in the Parliament of Paris gain this ability, they start to refuse Louis XV's tax increases to pay for the 7 Years' War. This is extremely problematic for Louis XV because remember, Britain is outspending the French big time during the 7 Years' War. And so, and the reason that Louis XV has such a hard time keeping up with the British spending is precisely because he has let the power of absolutism slip through his fingers, and now he is having to deal with nobles who are refusing to accept his absolute authority. When the 7 Years' War comes to an end, Louis XV decides that he's going to try to regain control in France, re-establish himself as an absolute ruler. So what he does is he appoints this guy by the name of René de Maupeou as a financial chancellor to reduce judicial opposition in the Parliament of Paris. And what they ultimately end up succeeding in doing is completely doing away with the Parliament of Paris. They abolish the Parliament of Paris, and they instead, in its place, create this new thing called Docile Parliament. Now, if you know what that word docile means, it means like calm or non-threatening. If you have an animal that's docile, like Mochi is docile, that means that he's not going to bite you, he's not going to scratch you, he's calm, right? He's not going to offer any threat to you. And that's what they do with this new docile parliament, is that this parliament is not going to pose any threat to Louis XV's absolute authority towards the tail end of his reign. Remember that this is a little too late, because he's already lost the 7 Years' War by this point. Once again, privileged groups start to get taxed. Of course, they hate that. Towards the end of his reign, Louis XV is absolutely excoriated by the nobles in France. They hate him because he is forcing them to pay taxes that they don't want to pay and stuff like that. The public was extremely critical of Louis XV's reign at the end of his career, and he was not very well liked by the end. He was viewed as increasingly hostile, increasingly difficult, and so on. He wasn't the young, fun party boy that he used to be anymore. And the reason that he's not is because Louis XV, although he may have kind of dropped the ball in the beginning of his career as King of France, he's not stupid. He recognizes that France is reaching a breaking point in terms of its economic stability, because the French taxation system was completely upside down and unfair, and France was in just unbelievably, exorbitantly huge amounts of debt, after having lost the 7 Years' War, and after having participated in the American Revolution under Louis XVI, who succeeds Louis XV. The situation gets even worse. And so when Louis XV dies, okay, he is replaced by his grandson, Louis XVI. Now, when we talk about immediate causes of the French Revolution, we can consider the entire reign of Louis XVI, starting in 1774, about 15 years before the French Revolution actually begins, as an immediate cause. Because Louis XVI, when he first comes to power in France, he thinks mistakenly, think back to when we learned about Machiavelli and the kinds of techniques that Machiavelli advocated for. Machiavelli, remember, was all about using fear and doing all of the bad things at once. You know, it's good to be feared and loved, but between the two, you'd rather be feared than loved, because if you are feared, people will listen to you. If you're loved, people will stab you in the back. Unfortunately, Louis XVI must have missed the Machiavelli lesson in history class, and when he comes to power, because he is so anxious to be loved by the nobles, what he immediately does is he undoes all of these absolutist things that Louis XV had done at the end of his career by creating the new Docile Parliament and all of that sort of thing. Louis XVI completely reverses trajectory. He says, I don't want the nobles to hate me. I don't want the nobles to be my enemy. I want to work with the nobles to be able to have a successful reign as king. This was a major, major, major mistake on Louis XVI's part, because when he realizes, which is too little too late, the same thing that Louis XV did years earlier, when he realizes that France is on the verge of bankruptcy and changes need to be made, because he undid these absolutist policies, he was unable to control the nobles. And the nobles reject the king and his proposals when he actually finally gets off his rear end and decides to start trying to solve problems in France right on the eve of the French Revolution. And so, you know, during Louis XVI's reign, he is hopelessly inept. Okay, Louis XVI is viewed, even by his own grandfather, before his grandfather died, Louis XV, the last king. Louis XV, I think, described his grandson as a fat, ill-bred boy who is a schlub, a kid who is completely unprepared to take over the position of King of France. Okay, maybe it wasn't Louis XV who described his grandson that way, but Louis XV knew that Louis XVI was going to be a troubled ruler. Making matters worse, Louis XVI was married to a woman from Austria. And if you'll recall, the French and the Austrians don't exactly have a long-standing happy history with one another either. And so they had only recently been on the same side of the 7 Years' War. But aside from that, the point being that for a long time, the French and the Habsburgs didn't get along with one another. And so when he marries Marie Antoinette, who was a Habsburg princess, the French population is not too enamored with her. And in the early part of Louis XVI's reign, they basically do nothing but party at Versailles and spend untold amounts of money on all sorts of frivolous things, okay? And they allow the situation in France to reach a point where it is boiling over and ready to explode. And so Louis XVI is an inept king who is completely, there's certain, I don't know if you guys know anything about like leadership qualities. It's really hard to teach people leadership qualities. There are certain people who just have natural proclivities towards leadership. And Louis XVI is not one of these people, okay? Suffice it to say. He is a person who is quiet. He is extremely easily influenced. He is not a guy with a very strong backbone. And this means that he's going to be very easily persuaded by a number of people who do not have his best interest at stake. And it's going to mean that he lets a lot of problems get to the point beyond where they're going to be fixable. So that's Louis XVI. Going into the French Revolution, we do have to note that France does have a lot of things going for it. They have the largest population of Europe. They're the wealthiest country in Europe. They have an extremely productive economy. Think about this. The French exports to all of Europe were actually even larger than Britain's exports to Europe, which is saying something. And then two, remember that going back hundreds of years, French culture and intellectual discoveries had dominated Europe. Between astronomical discoveries, between political and social practices, art, music, you name it. French culture had been extremely influential. Even, remember, Peter the Great had stolen a whole bunch of practices from the French court and brought them back to Russia. So the French are very, very important. They are the center of political and economic power in Europe at the end of the 1700s. In some sense, every bit as influential as Britain was. But the reason that Britain ends up being more influential is because their navy ends up being stronger. Internationally, Britain is much more influential than the French become. But in Europe, France is every bit as influential as Britain is. And so, as we look at the state of the French society, we've talked about this before, going all the way back to the beginning of our class in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, European society had been divided into the first, second, and third estate. Think of these as being essentially rigid social classes that you are born into. And so you had the first estate, which was the clergy. They were only 1% of the population, but the French Gallican Church owned 20%, a fifth of the lands of Europe, or of France rather, of France. Think about that for a second. 1% of the population owning 20% of the land. That is hugely imbalanced. Then add to that the second estate, which was the nobility. These are people with noble titles born into their noble title, or who had purchased their noble title and became nobles of the robe, and then that passed down through the generations. Again, they only make up about anywhere from about 2 to 4% of the population, and I'm really stretching it to say 4. More realistically, 2 to 3% of the population. So when we look at the first and second estate, they make up roughly 3 or 4% of the population, yet they own, between the two of them, over half of the land of France. 3% of the population has nearly 60%, okay, really almost 2/3 of the lands of France. Consider that for a minute, okay? That is a huge amount of economic inequality. And then you have the third estate, which made up about 95 to 97% of the population. It was made up of, you have to understand, because the third estate is such a huge segment of the population, we kind of have to further subdivide it. So let's take a look. I already talked about this. This is just first estate clergy. Issues regarding the clergy were not really a major cause of the revolution. We have to understand the clergy is kind of not really the main focus here of the French Revolution. The second estate is much more of a focus, because the second estate has this major resurgence, and both after the death of Louis XIV and after the death of Louis XV, the second estate, the nobility, because of this major resurgence where they're challenging the king's authority, they have a lot more to do with why the French Revolution takes place. And they tax the peasants for their own profit, so that's another reason. But the third estate, because it's such a huge segment of the population, we have to further divide it into kind of several different types of people. You have wealthy merchants, professionals, who we'll call the bourgeoisie, okay? These are people who have educations, they're lawyers, they're bankers, they're wealthy merchants. They are successful, wealthy folks. However, they are not nobles. And because they're not nobles, for every dollar they earn, and France didn't use the dollar, but I'm just using that phrase, for every dollar they earn, over 50 cents of every dollar that they earn is immediately paid to taxes. Meaning, and I want you to think about that, because a 50% tax rate is extremely punishing. That's a very, very, very high tax rate. And the third estate bears the largest responsibility of the taxes. There's all sorts of taxes that the French third estate had to pay. They had the tithe, that's how you say that, the tithe, the land tax. They also had the tithe, which is the church tax, which was 10% of your annual income. No choice, you had to pay it. Didn't matter if you were religious or not. You had to pay your 10% of your income to the church. You had an income tax. You had a poll tax. You had a salt tax. They're taxed, and they hate it. And they also have no ability to participate in government. So the bourgeoisie, being the wealthiest non-nobles in France, are going to be the ones that have the biggest stake in seeing the government of France change, reform, okay? The peasants are kind of, uneducated nobodies who are living in rural farming areas. They're not going to stand to gain a whole lot from the revolution, but at least hopefully they would be better represented, if there was a Republican-style government put into place. But the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, are going to be the people who are most in favor of the revolution. But they're not the only part of the third estate. The peasants actually were the largest segment of the third estate. If we're looking at the total population of France, the peasants made up about 80% of the population of France. That's a whole lot of people. And then you also had a smaller segment, and really the worst off segment of the third estate, the poorest segment, were the urban workers. Urban workers made up about, we'll say 7 to 10% of the French total population. And so, but they had it the worst off. They made the least amount of money, and they had the hardest living conditions of anyone in France, because they were living in extremely dirty, overcrowded urban setting. But nonetheless, the most influential segment in terms of the French Revolution is going to be the bourgeoisie in terms of what goes on. But those are the three major categories of people who make up the third estate. Each of them taxed unfairly, each of them excluded from participating in government. And then too, there were other things that the peasants had to participate in, like the corvée, which obligated peasants to work for their nobles, that land that they lived on, for several days a year for free, without pay, fixing roads, doing hard manual labor. And they didn't have a choice in that either. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Please do go onto Canvas and get the first 14 questions done on the reading guide by Wednesday, and we'll pick it up there. And as I said, we're just going to have to kind of do the best that we can, folks. I'm going to be turning and burning through material here this semester to try to catch us up and get you up to speed. I still don't know exactly what the AP exam is going to look like. I'm really hoping that they pare it down, because boy, it's been hard to teach AP Euro in a distance setting with the amount of instructional time that I have with you and the limited amount of practice. Normally we would use our time less for lecturing and more for doing group activities and stuff, but it is what it is. So, all right, folks, welcome back. Happy 2021, and we'll catch you again soon. See you Wednesday.